What if I told you that 4 American presidents were murdered in office, and the official stories we were taught in school don't even come close to the full picture? That witnesses vanished, evidence disappeared, and files stayed sealed for generations because certain questions were apparently too dangerous to answer. You probably think you know these stories. Lincoln, shot at the theater. Kennedy, shot in Dallas. Case closed, right? But here's the uncomfortable truth. The deeper you dig into presidential assassinations, the messier things get. Missing autopsy photos, conflicting witness testimony, investigators who died under strange circumstances before they could testify. Now, I want to be clear about something before we start. Some of what you're about to hear is documented fact, pulled straight from declassified government files and congressional investigations. Some of it lives in that gray area of unresolved questions and competing theories that historians still argue about at 2 in the morning. I'll be honest with you about which is which as we go, because you deserve the truth, not just the version that makes the best headline. So before we begin, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like, because YouTube's algorithm buries stories like this, and I need your help getting these forgotten details in front of more people. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, and prepare to learn 50 things about presidential assassinations that never made it into your history textbook. Let's start with the assassination that supposedly ended with one man, one gun, and one motive. Except it didn't. Number 1, John Wilkes Booth may not have acted alone, and the government may have known it. April 1865, the Civil War has just ended, and Abraham Lincoln is sitting in a theater box at Ford's Theater, finally allowing himself to relax. Then John Wilkes Booth walks in with a single-shot Derringer pistol and changes American history forever. The official story says Booth acted with a small group of conspirators, mostly amateurs, mostly caught. But here's where things get strange. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton controlled the investigation almost entirely. He seized evidence. He controlled which witnesses testified. He even had Booth's own diary in his possession for years before it surfaced publicly. And when it did, 18 pages were missing. Cut clean out. Nobody knows what was on them. Some historians believe those pages named names Stanton didn't want connected to the plot. Others think they contain nothing more than Booth's self-pitying ramblings. We simply don't know, because the man running the investigation controlled the evidence and never fully explained the gap. It's the kind of detail that makes you wonder what else got quietly buried. Number 2, Lincoln's unusually open carriage should have raised more red flags than it did. On the night of April 14, 1865, the president of a nation still smoldering from Civil War climbed into an open carriage to ride to Ford's Theater. No armored vehicle, obviously, this was 1865, but also no significant security detail surrounding him. Just a horse-drawn carriage, exposed on all sides, rolling through the streets of Washington, D.C. Lincoln had received death threats throughout his presidency. Hundreds of them, some historians estimate. The war had just ended. Emotions were raw, and plenty of Confederate sympathizers were still walking around Washington nursing their grudges. Yet the man in charge of the entire Union traveled to a public theater in a carriage that offered him zero protection from anyone with a clear line of sight and a steady hand. Some historians argue this wasn't recklessness so much as it was simply how things were done back then. Presidential security as a formal concept barely existed. The Secret Service wouldn't even be founded until later that same year. And its original purpose wasn't presidential protection at all. It was catching counterfeiters. Other historians push back on that explanation, pointing out that Lincoln himself had expressed unease about his safety in the weeks before his death, telling friends about strange dreams and premonitions. So did Lincoln ignore his own instincts, or was this just business as usual for a country that hadn't yet learned its lesson? We'll probably never know for certain. But the image of the president rolling through the Capitol in an open carriage on the very night he'd be shot still feels like a warning nobody heeded. Number 3, the missing presidential guard remains one of the strangest footnotes in this entire story. Lincoln did technically have a bodyguard assigned to him that night, a Washington police officer named John Parker. His job was simple: stand outside the president's theater box and make sure nobody got in who shouldn't. Instead, at some point during the performance, Parker left his post entirely. Some accounts say he wandered off to get a better view of the play from a different seat. Other accounts suggest he slipped out of the theater altogether to grab a drink at a nearby tavern. Either way, the seat meant to protect the President of the United States sat empty when John Wilkes Booth strolled up, opened the door, and stepped inside. Parker was never formally punished for this failure. No court-martial, no serious disciplinary hearing, nothing beyond an internal complaint that seems to have quietly disappeared into a filing cabinet somewhere. He kept his job on the police force for years afterward. This has fueled decades of speculation. Was Parker simply incompetent, a low-level officer who made an unforgivable mistake but wasn't part of any larger scheme? That's the conclusion most mainstream historians land on. But others point to the lack of any real consequences and ask why an officer who allowed the president's assassin unrestricted access wasn't held more accountable. Was someone protecting Parker? Or was the government just embarrassed and eager to move on? Without further documentation, this stays firmly in the realm of theory, but it's the kind of loose thread that makes you want to keep pulling. Number 4, John Wilkes Booth's easy access to Ford's Theater wasn't luck, it was familiarity. Booth wasn't some random outsider who stumbled into the building that night. He was a well-known actor who had performed on that very stage multiple times. The staff recognized his face. The layout of the hallways, the doors, the private box where the president sat. Booth knew all of it intimately because he'd walked those same halls as a performer for years. This meant he could move through the building without anyone questioning why he was there. When he approached the door to the president's box, nobody stopped him because why would they? He was John Wilkes Booth, a familiar face in a familiar place. He'd even reportedly used his celebrity status earlier that day to learn the president's schedule, since theater staff would naturally mention who was attending that evening's performance to someone they considered practically part of the furniture. Some researchers argue this level of access should have prompted tighter security protocols specifically because Booth was a known figure with strong Confederate sympathies that some in Washington were aware of. Others maintain that in 1865 nobody had built the infrastructure to think that way yet, and Booth's fame was simply incidental to his opportunity rather than evidence of a deeper plan. Still, the fact remains that the president's assassin didn't need to sneak, bribe, or force his way into a position to commit murder. He just needed to be recognized as the actor who belonged there. That comfort, that familiarity, may have been the single most overlooked security failure of the entire tragedy. Number 4, the edited line in Our American Cousin might be the single detail that turns this whole tragedy into a piece of theatrical choreography. The play running at Ford's Theater that night contained a line delivered by actor Harry Hawk that was guaranteed to bring the house down. Something about being a well-known character in society, a joke the audience had heard build toward all evening. Booth, as a professional actor himself, knew this play. He knew its rhythms, its laugh lines, its exact comedic timing down to the second. Historians and researchers who've studied the assassination closely believe Booth deliberately waited for that specific punchline, the moment when Hawk delivered his joke and the entire audience erupted into laughter loud enough to drown out almost anything, including the crack of a single gunshot. If true, this wasn't the act of a man acting on blind rage or impulse. This was planning refined down to comedic timing, using an audience's own laughter as cover for murder. Some skeptics argue this detail has been romanticized over the decades, turned into a slightly too clean narrative that makes Booth look like a criminal mastermind rather than a desperate man improvising under pressure. It's entirely possible the timing was coincidental, that Booth simply chose the moment when the box door was unguarded and the play happened to be at a loud point. But the alternative, that Booth studied the script closely enough to weaponize a punchline, remains one of the more chilling theories historians continue to debate. Either way, that single joke, meant to make people laugh, became forever linked to the exact second an American president was shot. Number 5. The Derringer pistol Booth used tells its own strange story about how such a monumental crime came down to something almost absurdly small. This wasn't some elaborate weapon built for the occasion. It was a single-shot .44 caliber Philadelphia Derringer pistol, a small, easily concealed gun designed more for close-range self-defense than for assassinating heads of state. It held exactly one bullet. Booth had one chance, one shot, and no room for error. He fired at point-blank range from just a few feet behind Lincoln, striking him in the back of the head. The Derringer's tiny size is actually part of why Booth could carry it into the theater without drawing attention. It fit easily into a pocket, small enough to remain hidden right up until the moment he used it. Some historians find this detail almost unsettling in its simplicity. The fate of the nation's leader came down to a small, unremarkable pocket pistol that a man could buy without much difficulty. Others point out that the Derringer's limitations, one shot, short range, meant Booth's plan required him to get impossibly close to his target, which he did specifically because Parker's post was empty and nobody stopped him. Had there been any resistance, any obstacle between Booth and the president's chair, the entire plan likely falls apart. The Derringer sits today in a museum, a small piece of metal that changed the direction of American history in a fraction of a second. Number 6. The broken leg question adds a layer of uncertainty to Booth's escape that historians still argue about today. After firing the fatal shot, Booth leaped from the presidential box down to the stage below, a jump of roughly 9 to 12 feet, depending on which account you read. He broke his leg during the escape, a fibula fracture that would slow him down for the rest of his flight and eventually contribute to law enforcement tracking him down. The traditional story says Booth's spur caught on a flag decorating the box, causing him to land awkwardly on the stage in front of a horrified audience. But some researchers have raised questions about whether the injury actually happened during the jump at all. A few accounts suggest Booth may have injured his leg later, possibly when his horse stumbled or fell during his nighttime ride out of the city. If that's true, the dramatic image of Booth leaping heroically from the box, breaking his leg on landing, and shouting a Latin phrase to the stunned crowd might be more legend than fact. It's a small discrepancy, but it matters because it shapes how we understand Booth's mental state and physical condition during those crucial first hours of his escape. Was he already compromised and vulnerable the moment he hit the ground, or did his injury come later, meaning he fled the theater in far better shape than the popular story suggests? Without more definitive sources, historians remain divided, and the exact sequence of that leap, that landing, and that leg remains one of the smaller but persistent mysteries surrounding history's most famous assassination. Number 7. The contents of Lincoln's pockets that night read like a strange inventory of an ordinary man, rather than a president about to become a martyr. When Lincoln was undressed at the Peterson house, doctors and witnesses cataloged what he'd been carrying, and the list has fascinated historians ever since. 2 pairs of spectacles, one for reading and one that had been mended with string, a small pocket knife, a watch fob without the watch attached, a handkerchief embroidered with his name, and a brown leather wallet containing a $5 Confederate note. That last item has puzzled people for over a century. Why would the President of the United States be carrying Confederate currency in his pocket just days after the Civil War effectively ended? Some historians believe it was a souvenir, something Lincoln picked up during his visit to Richmond just 2 weeks earlier when he walked through the fallen Confederate capital. Others have floated more symbolic theories, suggesting Lincoln kept it as a private reminder of the war's cost, or perhaps intended it as a keepsake for one of his sons. There's no definitive answer, and Lincoln himself never explained it to anyone who left a written record. The spectacles held together with string tell their own quiet story too, a reminder that even the most powerful man in the country was still just a person who made do with what he had rather than replacing something that still worked. These small, mundane objects pulled from the pockets of a dying man ended up preserved in the Library of Congress where they remain today. There's something almost unbearably human about it. Spectacles, a knife, a handkerchief, ordinary things carried by a man who had no idea that night would be his last. Number 8, and speaking of things nobody planned for, the choice to carry Lincoln to the Peterson house instead of treating him at Ford's Theater came down to simple logistics rather than any grand decision. Doctors in the box immediately recognized the wound was fatal, but moving a dying president required somewhere to put him. Ford's Theater itself offered no suitable bed, no private space appropriate for a head of state to die in. So a group of soldiers and civilians carried Lincoln out of the theater, across 10th Street, looking for anywhere that would take them in. A man standing in the doorway of a boarding house across the street, William Peterson's house, waved them inside. They carried Lincoln into a small back bedroom rented by a boarder named William Clark, who wasn't even home that night. The irony is almost too on the nose. Lincoln at 6'4" had to be laid diagonally across a bed far too short for him, because the room itself was rented by an ordinary working man who had no idea history would be made in his absence. Doctors, cabinet members, and family members crowded into that tiny room for the next 9 hours, keeping vigil as Lincoln's condition worsened. The room became a strange, cramped stage for the final act of the assassination, a modest boarding house bedroom instead of anywhere befitting a president. Some historians point to this as one of the more overlooked ironies of that night, that the country's most consequential death occurred not in a grand hall or a hospital, but in a rented room because there was simply nowhere else to go. Number 9. And speaking of that crowded room, it quickly became something closer to a command center than a deathbed vigil, largely because Secretary of War Edwin Stanton refused to let chaos take over. Stanton arrived within the hour and effectively took charge of the entire government's response from inside that small bedroom. He set up a makeshift office in the adjoining parlor, questioning witnesses, sending telegrams, and coordinating the massive manhunt for Booth, all while the president lay dying just a few feet away. Some historians argue Stanton essentially ran the country from that room for several hours, issuing orders, gathering testimony, and making decisions no one else was positioned to make. He insisted on interviewing witnesses immediately while their memories were fresh, and many of the eyewitness accounts historians still rely on today exist because Stanton demanded they be recorded that very night. His urgency likely helped launch the manhunt faster than it otherwise would have moved. But it's also raised questions among some researchers about how much control Stanton assumed in the immediate aftermath, and whether his aggressive management of the scene, the testimony, and the information reflected pure competence, or something slightly more calculated. Most historians land firmly on the side of competence and crisis leadership rather than conspiracy, but the sheer speed and control Stanton exercised that night remains a detail worth sitting with. A government essentially operated out of a rented bedroom for 9 hours, while its head of state lay dying in the corner, and the man holding it all together was the Secretary of War, scribbling orders by candlelight. Number 10. And speaking of Stanton coordinating a manhunt from that cramped little room, the reason his urgency mattered so much is that Lincoln wasn't the only target that night. John Wilkes Booth hadn't planned a lone act of violence. He'd organized what he believed would be a simultaneous, three-pronged decapitation of the federal government. While Booth made his way into Ford's Theater, 2 other men were assigned to strike at the same hour, one targeting Vice President Andrew Johnson, the other targeting Secretary of State William Seward. The idea was to eliminate the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State all within the same narrow window, throwing the Union into chaos at a moment when the Confederacy had just collapsed. Some historians believe Booth hoped this kind of simultaneous strike might somehow revive the Confederate cause, or at least cripple the government long enough to create an opening. Others argue it was less a coherent strategy and more the fantasy of a man who'd convinced himself he was starring in his own historical drama. Whatever the reasoning, the plan required precision timing and reliable men, 2 things Booth's conspiracy sorely lacked. Only one of the 3 assassins that night actually completed his assignment. The other 2 failed in very different ways, one through simple cowardice, the other through a level of brutality that nearly succeeded. It's worth remembering that April 14, 1865 was supposed to be a night of 3 assassinations, not 1. Had all 3 attacks succeeded, the country would have lost its president, its vice president, and its Secretary of State within the same few hours, an unprecedented collapse of government leadership that historians still find chilling to imagine, even a century and a half later. Number 11, and speaking of the men who failed, George Atzerodt was assigned what should have been the simplest task of the entire conspiracy, and he still couldn't manage it. Booth ordered him to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, who was staying alone at the Kirkwood House Hotel in Washington with minimal security. Atzerodt rented a room directly above Johnson's, giving him easy access and plenty of opportunity. By most accounts, he had every advantage a would-be assassin could ask for. But when the moment came, Atzerodt simply couldn't go through with it. He later admitted he wandered the streets of Washington that night instead, drinking heavily at a nearby bar rather than climbing the stairs to Johnson's room. Some historians suggest Atzerodt was never fully committed to assassination in the first place. He'd originally signed on to Booth's earlier scheme to kidnap Lincoln, a plan that dissolved before it ever happened, and killing a sitting vice president may have felt like an entirely different level of commitment than he'd bargained for. Whatever his reasoning, his failure to act likely saved Andrew Johnson's life, which is a strange thought considering how contentious Johnson's presidency would later become. Atzerodt didn't get away with his inaction for long. He fled Washington but was captured within days, and his abandoned hotel room, along with witnesses who placed him there, made his role in the conspiracy impossible to deny. He was tried alongside the other conspirators and hanged that summer, a man executed not for what he did, but largely for what he'd agreed to do and then lost his nerve to carry out. Number 12. And speaking of conspirators who didn't lose their nerve, Lewis Powell's assignment was Secretary of State William Seward, and unlike Atzerodt, Powell followed through with terrifying commitment. Seward was recovering at home from a serious carriage accident that had already left him with a broken jaw and arm, confined to bed under the care of family and a night nurse. Powell talked his way into the house that night by claiming he had medicine the secretary needed, then forced his way upstairs and attacked Seward with a knife, slashing at his face and neck repeatedly in the darkened bedroom. Seward's son and a soldier assigned to guard the house both tried to intervene and were seriously injured in the struggle themselves. By most accounts, the only reason Seward survived at all was the metal brace he was wearing for his broken jaw, which is believed to have deflected at least one blow that otherwise would have been fatal. Seward was left with severe wounds to his face and neck, and the room was reportedly soaked in blood by the time Powell fled into the night, believing he'd killed the Secretary of State. Seward's recovery was slow and painful, but he did recover, eventually returning to government service and continuing his political career for years afterward. Powell wasn't as fortunate. He was captured days later, hiding near a boarding house connected to the conspiracy, tried alongside the other assassins, and hanged that July alongside Atzerodt. Of the 3 coordinated attacks planned for that single night, Powell's was the only one that came close to succeeding as intended, a brutal, almost successful footnote to a conspiracy that history remembers almost entirely for what happened inside Ford's Theater instead. Number 13, and speaking of a conspiracy that left more questions than answers, one of the strangest mysteries involves a small leather diary found in Booth's pocket the night he was finally cornered. When soldiers searched his body after the standoff at the Garrett farm, they discovered a date book Booth had been carrying, filled with his own handwritten reflections on the assassination and his flight afterward. It should have been one of the most valuable pieces of evidence in American history, a first-hand account from the assassin himself, explaining his motives in his own words during the days he spent as a fugitive. Instead, when the diary eventually surfaced as evidence, investigators and researchers noticed something troubling. Several pages were missing, cut or torn out cleanly, leaving gaps in Booth's own account of those final days. The diary passed through multiple hands before it became public, first held by the War Department, then eventually landing in the hands of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton's office for years before anyone outside the government got a serious look at it. By the time historians and journalists gained access, the missing pages were already gone, and no one connected to the investigation ever offered a clear explanation for what happened to them. Some historians believe the missing pages simply fell out or deteriorated through years of careless handling, an unglamorous but plausible explanation for old, fragile paper passed between officials who weren't exactly treating it like a museum artifact. Others have pointed to Stanton himself, noting his unusual level of control over the investigation and his office's possession of the diary for an extended stretch of time. And they've asked why a man so meticulous about handling evidence in every other aspect of the case would allow pages to vanish without comment. A few researchers have speculated the missing pages might have contained references to other conspirators, additional planning details, or information that could have raised uncomfortable questions about who else may have known what Booth intended to do. None of these theories have ever been proven, and no missing pages have ever resurfaced in the century and a half since. What we're left with is an incomplete diary from the one person who could have explained his own motivations most directly, with gaps precisely where his private thoughts during the manhunt should be. It's the kind of unresolved detail that keeps historians arguing at conferences decades later, not because anyone has hard evidence of a cover-up, but because the alternative explanation, simple carelessness with one of the most important documents in American history, feels almost as unsatisfying. Whatever happened to those pages, they remain missing, and Booth's final thoughts on his crime remain permanently incomplete. Number 14, and speaking of Booth's final days, They came to an end in a tobacco barn on a farm belonging to a man named Richard Garrett in rural Virginia, in a scene that was every bit as chaotic as the manhunt that preceded it. After nearly 2 weeks on the run, Booth and his remaining accomplice, David Harold, had been tracked to the Garrett property by federal cavalry acting on tips gathered during the massive search. The soldiers surrounded the barn where the two men were hiding in the pre-dawn hours, and a standoff began that would end Booth's life in a manner almost as dramatic as the crime that started the chase. Harold, who apparently had considerably less appetite for a violent last stand than Booth did, surrendered and walked out of the barn with his hands up. Booth refused, reportedly declaring he intended to fight his way out rather than be taken alive. With Booth still inside and unwilling to negotiate, the soldiers made the decision to set the barn on fire, hoping to force him into the open where he could be captured. The flames spread quickly through the dry tobacco barn, and through the smoke and firelight, a soldier named Sergeant Boston Corbett fired a single shot that struck Booth in the neck. Corbett would later claim he acted because he believed Booth was raising a weapon to fire on the soldiers outside, though he'd been explicitly ordered to take Booth alive if at all possible. Booth was pulled from the burning barn paralyzed and dying, and he lingered for a few final hours before succumbing to his wound on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse. Corbett faced no serious punishment for disobeying orders, a fact that has struck some historians as notable given how badly the government wanted Booth alive for questioning about the full scope of the conspiracy. With Booth dead, any answers he might have provided about additional conspirators, deeper motives, or Confederate involvement died with him in that burning barn. Some historians view Corbett's shot as a simple battlefield decision made under chaotic, smoke-filled circumstances by a soldier genuinely fearing for his life and the lives of his fellow soldiers. Others have wondered aloud whether certain people in power might have preferred Booth silenced rather than questioned at length in a courtroom. Corbett himself became something of a minor celebrity afterward, though his later life took strange turns that only added to the general sense that nothing about this case ever resolved itself cleanly. Number 15. And speaking of question marks that never fully closed, few figures in the conspiracy remain as contested as Mary Surratt, the boarding house owner whose home on H Street in Washington served as a regular meeting place for Booth and his co-conspirators in the weeks leading up to the assassination. Surratt ran a respectable establishment by most accounts, and her son John was deeply involved in Booth's earlier kidnapping scheme and possibly the assassination plot itself, though he managed to flee the country before authorities could arrest him. Mary herself was arrested within days of Lincoln's death and put on trial before a military commission rather than a civilian court, a decision that has drawn scrutiny from legal historians ever since, given that she was a civilian facing charges that arguably belonged in front of a jury rather than a panel of army officers. The evidence against her was largely circumstantial, built around her connections to the other conspirators, an errand she ran on the day of the assassination, and testimony from witnesses whose reliability has been debated for generations. Prosecutors argued she knew exactly what Booth intended and provided material support for the plot. Her defenders then and now have argued she was a mother caught in her son's dangerous associations, someone who may have overheard far more than she understood the significance of at the time. The military commission convicted her, and she became the first woman executed by the federal government, hanged in July of 1865 alongside Powell, Atzerodt, and another conspirator named David Harold. President Johnson reportedly ignored or never received a plea for clemency that some commission members had recommended, though accounts of exactly what happened to that recommendation remain murky and disputed. Historians still argue today about whether Mary Surratt was a knowing participant in a presidential assassination, or a woman executed largely for the crime of running a boarding house where dangerous men happened to gather. Her son John, notably, was eventually captured years later and tried in a civilian court where a jury deadlocked and failed to convict him of anything, a strange contrast to his mother's swift military tribunal and execution that continues to raise uncomfortable questions about how justice was administered in the raw, vengeful aftermath of Lincoln's death. Number 16. And speaking of endings that turned into national spectacles, Lincoln's death didn't conclude with a quiet burial in Washington. Instead, his body embarked on one of the strangest journeys in American history, a 19-day funeral procession by train that wound through the northern states before finally reaching Springfield, Illinois, where Lincoln had asked to be laid to rest. The train stopped in city after city, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and dozens of smaller towns along the route. And at nearly every stop, officials opened the casket so mourners could file past and view the president's face one final time. Millions of Americans reportedly saw Lincoln's body during this tour, an almost unimaginable number for the era, and the spectacle became something close to a shared national ritual of grief. Behind the scenes, though, keeping a body presentable for public viewing across 19 days and thousands of miles required constant intervention from embalmers who traveled with the train, touching up Lincoln's appearance at every stop as the effects of decomposition became harder to mask. Some newspaper accounts from later stops on the tour noted that Lincoln's face looked increasingly different from earlier viewings, a detail that unsettled some observers even at the time. There's also the matter of who exactly orchestrated this unprecedented display. Edwin Stanton, once again playing an outsized role in the aftermath of the assassination, was largely responsible for planning the route and the extended public viewing schedule, and some historians have wondered whether the decision was driven purely by genuine national mourning or whether it also served a more calculated purpose, cementing Lincoln's martyrdom in the public imagination at a moment when the country desperately needed unifying symbols. None of this suggests anything sinister exactly, but it does reveal how quickly Lincoln's death was transformed from a personal tragedy into a carefully managed piece of political theater, one designed to shape how an entire nation would remember him. The train itself, along with the funeral car it carried, later suffered its own strange fate, destroyed by fire decades later in Minnesota, adding one more small mystery to an event that already blurred the line between genuine mourning and deliberate spectacle. Number 17. And speaking of presidents whose paths to death began with a small, almost forgettable decision, James Garfield's fatal encounter with fate started with a trip he apparently didn't even want to take. In the summer of 1881, Garfield was scheduled to travel to Williams College in Massachusetts, his alma mater, to deliver a speech and attend a reunion of sorts with old classmates. By multiple accounts, Garfield hesitated about making the trip at all, citing the demands of his schedule and perhaps a simple reluctance to spend days away from Washington during a politically sensitive stretch of his young presidency. It reportedly took some convincing from aides and close associates before Garfield agreed to go, boarding a train from the very station where, on his way to catch that connecting train, Charles Guiteau would be waiting with a pistol. It's a detail that tends to get lost in the larger, more dramatic story of Garfield's slow and agonizing death from infection, but it raises the same haunting question that follows so many assassinations throughout this list. Would history have unfolded differently if Garfield had simply stayed in Washington that day, satisfied his own initial instinct, and skipped a trip he wasn't especially enthusiastic about in the first place? Guiteau, as it turned out, had been tracking Garfield's public schedule for weeks, waiting for an opportunity that matched his own twisted sense of timing and opportunity. The fact that Garfield needed persuading to attend an event that ultimately placed him directly in his assassin's path adds an uncomfortable layer of near miss to an already tragic story, the kind of small human decision that historians can only look back on and wonder about, without ever really knowing what might have been. Number 18. And speaking of assassins driven by motives that seem almost absurd in hindsight, Charles Guiteau's entire justification for killing a president rested on a political favor he believed he was owed. Guiteau had written and distributed a largely incoherent speech during the 1880 presidential campaign, one he claimed helped secure Garfield's election, despite the fact that almost no one who heard it seemed to think it carried any real influence. In Guiteau's own mind, though, that speech entitled him to a reward, specifically a prestigious diplomatic posting, and he set his sights first on the ambassadorship to Austria before eventually settling his hopes on a consulship in Paris. He showed up repeatedly at the White House and the State Department, requesting meetings, submitting letters, and generally making himself an increasingly unwelcome presence among Garfield's staff, who viewed him as little more than a delusional nuisance rather than any kind of genuine threat. When it became clear that no appointment was coming, Guiteau's fixation curdled into something far darker, and he convinced himself that removing Garfield was not only justified but divinely ordered, a conviction he apparently never abandoned even after his arrest. What makes this motive so unsettling isn't its complexity, but its almost mundane pettiness, a man convinced that a bureaucratic snub warranted a presidential assassination. Guiteau's trial became something of a spectacle in its own right, as his lawyers pursued one of the earliest high-profile insanity defenses in American legal history, while Guiteau himself frequently interrupted proceedings with outbursts, poetry, and declarations of his own greatness. The jury ultimately rejected the insanity argument, and Guiteau was executed in 1882, leaving behind a case study that historians and psychologists still reference when discussing the strange, self-justifying logic that can drive a person toward political violence over what amounted to nothing more than an unanswered job application. Number 19. And speaking of locations that became permanently linked to tragedy, the building where Garfield was shot no longer exists, and its disappearance says something about how America tends to handle the physical scenes of its darkest moments. The shooting took place at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Depot in Washington, D.C., a station that once stood roughly where the National Gallery of Art sits today. It was a bustling hub in 1881, the kind of place where a sitting president could simply walk through a public waiting room with minimal security, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how differently presidential protection worked in that era. Garfield strolled into the depot that July morning with his Secretary of State, planning to catch a train completely unguarded in any meaningful sense, and Charles Guiteau was waiting for him in that same public space, revolver in hand. After the shooting, the depot didn't become a shrine or a memorial site the way you might expect. Instead, it continued operating as a functioning train station for years, commuters and travelers passing daily through the same hallways where a president had been gunned down. Eventually, in 1908, the building was demolished entirely to make way for new construction, erasing the physical location from the landscape almost as thoroughly as Garfield's death has been erased from the broader public memory of presidential assassinations. Most Americans can tell you Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. Far fewer could tell you Garfield was shot at a train station that no longer exists, in a spot now occupied by a museum. There's something almost poetic about a nation quietly paving over the site of one of its most avoidable tragedies, especially when you consider how little security surrounded Garfield that day compared to what would eventually become standard practice. A small plaque exists near the original site now, easy to miss if you're not looking for it, a modest acknowledgement of a moment that once dominated headlines across the country. The depot's disappearance also means historians and curious visitors can't walk the actual hallway where Guiteau waited, can't stand in the exact spot where the shots were fired, the way people still can at Ford's Theater. It's a small but strange footnote in the story of American assassinations, a reminder that not every historical tragedy gets preserved in stone and glass. Sometimes the physical evidence just gets torn down and replaced, and the memory fades along with the architecture. Number 20, and speaking of decisions that reveal exactly what kind of man Charles Guiteau was, his choice of weapon says almost as much about his psychology as the assassination itself. Guiteau didn't simply grab whatever gun happened to be available. He specifically sought out an ivory-handled revolver, a British Bulldog model, and by most accounts he chose it deliberately because he believed it would look more impressive someday sitting in a museum display case. Think about that for a moment. Before he had even committed the act, Guiteau was already picturing his own place in history, imagining crowds of future visitors gazing admiringly at the weapon he used to kill a president, and apparently he wanted that weapon to look good doing it. He reportedly paid extra for the ivory handle specifically because he thought a plain wooden grip wouldn't be dignified enough for what he considered a historically significant object. This wasn't a man acting purely out of desperation or blind rage. This was someone constructing a narrative around himself, casting himself as a figure of destiny whose actions would be studied and admired for generations, and he wanted the physical evidence of his crime to reflect that self-image. It's a small detail, but it lines up perfectly with everything else we know about Guiteau's inflated sense of self-importance, the same grandiosity that convinced him a rambling campaign speech entitled him to a diplomatic post in Paris. The revolver itself did eventually end up preserved, though its exact whereabouts have been the subject of some debate and confusion over the decades, with different institutions and collectors at various points claiming to have it or pieces of its history. Some accounts suggest it was displayed for a time before being lost track of again, which feels almost fitting for a man whose own legacy became a strange mixture of historical footnote and cautionary tale. Guiteau wanted to be remembered as significant, and in a grim, backhanded way, he got exactly that, just not in the manner he imagined. He's remembered less as a calculated historical figure and more as a case study in delusion, a man who spent more thought on how his murder weapon would look to future generations than on the actual human being he was about to shoot. Number 21. And speaking of details that turned a survivable shooting into a drawn-out medical catastrophe, the two bullets Guiteau fired that morning had wildly different effects on Garfield's body. The first shot merely grazed Garfield's arm, a wound that in isolation would have been minor, painful but hardly life-threatening, the kind of injury a president could plausibly have recovered from within weeks. The second shot, though, told a very different story. That bullet struck Garfield in the back and lodged deep inside his body, missing his spine by a narrow margin, but settling in a location that 19th century medicine simply wasn't equipped to handle safely. Doctors at the time had no reliable way to locate the bullet without probing the wound directly, and in an era before sterile surgical practices were widely accepted or even understood, that probing became the real threat to Garfield's life. Physicians repeatedly inserted unwashed fingers and unsterilized instruments into the wound, searching for a bullet they ultimately never found, introducing infection after infection into a wound that might otherwise have healed. Garfield lingered for nearly 80 days after the shooting, his condition steadily worsening not because of the bullet itself, but because of the treatment he received in the attempt to remove it. Inventor Alexander Graham Bell reportedly built a crude metal detector specifically to try locating the bullet inside Garfield's body, an effort that ultimately failed, partly because the metal bedframe Garfield was lying on interfered with the device. In the end, that second bullet stayed lodged in Garfield's body until his death, never fully understood by the doctors trying so desperately to remove it. It's a stark illustration of how survivable the shooting itself may have been, and how the medical response, not the assassin's aim, became the true cause of death. Number 22, and speaking of desperate attempts to save Garfield using cutting-edge technology that ultimately went nowhere, Alexander Graham Bell himself got personally involved in trying to locate that lodged bullet, and the story of his failed invention is one of the stranger footnotes in presidential medical history. By 1881, Bell had already made his name inventing the telephone just 5 years earlier, and he was still deeply immersed in experimenting with electrical devices of all kinds. When he heard that Garfield's doctors couldn't locate the bullet buried somewhere in the president's back, Bell saw an opportunity to apply his expertise towards something that might actually save a life rather than just revolutionize communication. He rapidly developed a device called an induction balance, essentially a crude early metal detector built specifically for this purpose. The theory behind it was sound. Metal objects disrupt electrical currents in a detectable way, and Bell believed his device could pinpoint the bullet's exact location without any further invasive probing, sparing Garfield from more unsterilized fingers digging around inside his body. Bell tested the device successfully on volunteers who had bullets or metal fragments in their bodies from other injuries, and the results were promising enough that he was brought to the White House to try it directly on the ailing president. This should have been a triumphant moment, cutting-edge science riding in to correct the damage caused by primitive medical practices. Instead, it became an exercise in frustration. When Bell ran his device over Garfield's body, he got confusing and inconsistent readings, signals that didn't seem to match where doctors expected the bullet to be. The likely culprit, as historians would later determine, was the metal coil spring mattress Garfield happened to be lying on, which interfered with the induction balance and threw off its readings entirely. Some accounts suggest Bell may have also picked up on the bullet itself but doubted his own results because the surrounding metal created so much interference that he couldn't be confident in what he was detecting. He tried adjusting his methods, but the confusion persisted, and ultimately the device failed to reliably locate the bullet's true position. Garfield's doctors, who had already committed to their own theories about where the bullet had traveled, largely dismissed Bell's inconclusive results anyway. It's a haunting bit of historical timing. One of the era's greatest inventive minds standing at the president's bedside, with a genuinely innovative piece of technology, undone not by faulty science, but by something as mundane as the furniture in the room. Bell reportedly continued refining his induction balance after Garfield's death, frustrated that his invention hadn't been given a fair chance to prove itself under better conditions. The device would later go on to have legitimate medical and practical applications elsewhere. But its most famous real-world test remains this failed attempt to save a dying president, forever linked to a metal bed frame that got in the way of history. Number 23. And speaking of medical decisions that likely did more harm than the original gunshot wound itself, the way Garfield's doctors treated his injury has become something of a textbook example in how not to practice medicine. This was 1881, just a few years after Joseph Lister had begun promoting the use of antiseptic techniques in surgery over in Europe. But American medicine at the time remained deeply skeptical of what many doctors dismissed as unnecessary fussiness. Garfield's lead physician, Dr. Willard Bliss, whose actual first name happened to be Doctor, a coincidence that sounds almost too strange to be true, took charge of the president's care and made decision after decision that modern medicine would consider catastrophic malpractice. Bliss and the other physicians attending Garfield repeatedly inserted their bare, unwashed fingers directly into the bullet wound, probing around blindly in an attempt to locate where the bullet had traveled. They used medical instruments that hadn't been sterilized in any meaningful sense, and they did this not once but repeatedly over the following weeks, each intrusion creating fresh opportunities for bacteria to enter Garfield's body. Rather than helping locate the bullet, which, as we've discussed, remained stubbornly elusive throughout his treatment, these repeated probings almost certainly introduced the infections that would ultimately kill him. Garfield's condition deteriorated slowly and painfully over nearly 80 days, developing abscesses, fevers, and systemic infections that spread throughout his weakened body. His weight dropped dramatically as he struggled to eat, and reports from the time describe a man wasting away in agonizing stages, a far cry from the relatively minor survivable wound he might have recovered from under different medical care. Some historians and doctors examining the case in later years have argued that Garfield likely would have survived entirely if his physicians had simply left the wound alone and let his own body handle the healing process, or at minimum practiced even basic sterilization. Instead, the very act of trying to help him became the mechanism of his death. It's worth noting that this wasn't necessarily malicious incompetence in the way we might judge it today. Antiseptic theory was still controversial in American medical circles, and many doctors genuinely believed cleanliness had little bearing on infection. But knowing what we know now, it's difficult not to look back at Garfield's treatment and see a president who was essentially killed by his own doctor's good intentions, poisoned slowly through decisions made in ignorance rather than malice, yet devastating all the same. Number 24. And speaking of desperate final efforts to save a dying president, Garfield's medical team eventually decided his best chance at recovery meant getting him out of the sweltering, infection-ridden air of Washington entirely. By early September of 1881, Garfield had been suffering for weeks in the White House, and doctors believed the oppressive summer heat in the Capitol was worsening his condition, making his recovery even less likely. So a decision was made to move him to Elberon, New Jersey, a small seaside community along the Jersey Shore, where cooler ocean breezes might offer some relief to a body ravaged by infection and fever. There was just one significant logistical problem. The cottage where Garfield would stay wasn't located anywhere near an existing railroad line, and moving a dying president any significant distance by carriage over bumpy 19th century roads risked worsening his already fragile condition considerably. The solution was almost absurdly ambitious given the circumstances. Railroad workers scrambled to construct an entirely temporary spur line, essentially building brand new railroad tracks in a remarkably short window of time, specifically so Garfield's train could travel directly to the cottage rather than forcing him through any additional jarring transport. Reports suggest this construction was completed in roughly 24 hours, an extraordinary feat of rapid infrastructure building driven purely by the urgency of trying to make a dying man's final days more comfortable. Garfield arrived at the seaside cottage and spent his remaining time there, surrounded by cooler air and ocean views rather than the stifling atmosphere of the White House. Unfortunately, the change in scenery couldn't undo weeks of accumulated infection and medical mistreatment. Garfield died at the cottage on September 19th, just days after arriving, having survived the shooting itself by nearly 80 agonizing days. The temporary railroad spur, built with such frantic urgency, quickly became obsolete once its singular purpose had been fulfilled. It stands today as a strange, largely forgotten symbol of the lengths people went to in a desperate attempt to save a president who, by that point, medical science of the era simply couldn't help. Sometimes the most remarkable engineering effort in the world still can't outpace the damage that's already been done. Number 25. And speaking of the chaos left behind by a presidency reduced to a sickroom drama, Garfield's nearly 80 days of lingering between life and death created a genuine constitutional crisis that the country had never really grappled with before. The Constitution at the time offered almost no clear guidance on what happens when a president is incapacitated but not technically dead. Garfield wasn't dead, but he also wasn't functioning as president in any meaningful sense. He couldn't sign legislation, couldn't make decisions, couldn't even reliably communicate given how weak and feverish he'd become. Vice President Chester Arthur found himself in an almost impossibly awkward position. Stepping in and assuming presidential authority while Garfield technically still lived might look like a power grab, especially given that Arthur had close ties to the stalwart faction of the Republican Party, the very political machine that Guiteau himself had claimed to be acting on behalf of when he pulled the trigger. That association alone made Arthur deeply cautious about appearing too eager to take charge. So for weeks, the executive branch essentially operated in a strange limbo. Cabinet members debated among themselves how much authority they actually had to act without direct presidential input. Some historians have suggested Arthur intentionally kept his distance from Washington during this period, staying largely out of public view, precisely because he didn't want to be seen as circling like a vulture waiting for Garfield to die. Whether that was genuine political sensitivity or simple discomfort with the situation is something historians still debate, but the practical effect was the same: a federal government running on autopilot while the man technically in charge of it lay dying in agony roughly 80 miles away. This uncertainty wasn't just theoretical either. Real government business appointments, foreign policy decisions, and administrative matters piled up without anyone entirely sure who had the standing to resolve them. The situation exposed a glaring gap in constitutional design that the founders simply hadn't anticipated: what happens to presidential power during a prolonged period of incapacitation rather than a clean, sudden death or a healthy presidency. It would take nearly a century, and another set of unsettling incidents involving disabled or absent presidents, before the country formally addressed this gap through the 25th Amendment in 1967, establishing clear procedures for exactly this kind of scenario. Garfield's slow decline, in other words, quietly planted the seeds for a constitutional fix that wouldn't bear fruit for generations. For those 80 strange days in 1881, though, the United States essentially had a president who couldn't govern and a vice president who wouldn't quite step up, leaving the machinery of government in an uneasy holding pattern nobody had planned for and nobody particularly wanted to be blamed for resolving. Number 26. And speaking of confusion at the highest levels of government, the courtroom drama surrounding Charles Guiteau's trial produced its own bizarre kind of chaos, this time centered on the question of whether the man was legally sane enough to be held responsible for what he'd done. Guiteau's defense strategy hinged almost entirely on an insanity plea, and given his behavior throughout the proceedings, it wasn't exactly a hard argument to make on the surface. He interrupted witnesses constantly, shouted objections without any legal standing to do so, dictated rambling statements to the press claiming that removing Garfield had been a political necessity rather than a crime, and at one point even tried to conduct portions of his own defense, despite having actual attorneys present to do the job. Yet in a contradiction that seemed to baffle observers at the time, Guiteau simultaneously insisted that his actions had been entirely justified and rational, framing the assassination as an act of divine will meant to save the Republican Party from internal collapse. He genuinely seemed to believe both that he wasn't responsible for his actions due to mental illness and that his actions had been the correct, calculated political move all along, two positions that don't exactly sit comfortably together. Medical experts brought in during the trial disagreed sharply on his mental state, some diagnosing him with clear signs of what we might now recognize as a serious personality disorder or delusional thinking, others insisting he understood perfectly well what he'd done and simply refused to accept consequences for it. The public, meanwhile, had little patience for nuance. Newspapers largely portrayed Guiteau as a theatrical lunatic putting on a show to escape the noose, and public sentiment overwhelmingly wanted him held fully accountable, regardless of what any doctor concluded about his psychology. The trial itself became something of a spectacle: packed courtrooms, sensational headlines, and a defendant who seemed almost to be enjoying the attention his own trial afforded him. In the end, the jury wasn't persuaded by the insanity argument, whether because they doubted its sincerity or simply couldn't separate genuine mental illness from calculated performance. Guiteau was found guilty and sentenced to death, a verdict that closed the legal chapter on Garfield's assassination even as it left open lasting questions about where the line between madness and manipulation truly sits. Number 27, and speaking of Guiteau's strange final performance, his last days leading up to execution offered one more deeply unsettling glimpse into just how disconnected from reality, or perhaps how theatrically self-aware he truly was. As his execution date approached in 1882, Guiteau remained convinced that some last-minute reversal of fortune awaited him, reportedly believing that public opinion would shift, that he'd be pardoned, or that some divine intervention would spare him entirely. When it became clear none of that was coming, he turned to something almost nobody expected: poetry. Standing at the gallows, Guiteau recited a poem he had composed himself titled "I'm Going to the Lordy," a piece written with an eerie, almost childlike simplicity that stood in stark contrast to the gravity of the moment. The poem framed his death not as punishment for murder, but as a kind of joyous ascension, a return to God who Guiteau still seemed to believe had guided his hand all along. Witnesses described the scene as deeply strange, a condemned man performing his own composed verse with theatrical flourish moments before his execution, seemingly more concerned with the poetic delivery than with any final reckoning over what he'd done. Some accounts suggest he even asked for musical accompaniment or gestured dramatically while reciting it, treating his final moments less like an execution and more like a stage performance he'd been building toward the entire time. It's a jarring historical footnote, the assassin of a president spending his last living moments reciting self-written rhymes about joining God rather than reflecting on the life he'd taken or the chaos he'd unleashed on the nation. Historians have long debated what this final act reveals about Guiteau's actual mental state. Was this the genuine expression of a deeply delusional mind that truly believed itself divinely appointed? Or was it one last calculated performance from a man who'd spent his entire adult life craving attention and recognition he never earned through legitimate means? Whatever the truth, the poem has survived as a bizarre historical artifact, a strange final punctuation mark on one of the most chaotic and medically mismanaged presidential deaths in American history, closing the story of Garfield's assassination, not with solemn dignity, but with an unsettling little rhyme about going to meet the Lord. Number 28. And speaking of presidents whose fatal encounters with the public came wrapped in an almost unbearable irony, William McKinley's final public appearance took place at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, on September 6, 1901, an event specifically designed to showcase American progress, technology, and the bright optimism of a new century. McKinley loved these kinds of public receptions. Unlike some presidents who kept the public at arm's length out of caution or personality, McKinley genuinely enjoyed meeting ordinary citizens face to face. He believed that direct, personal contact with the American people was part of what made the presidency meaningful, a reflection of democratic accessibility rather than distant, untouchable power. So on that September afternoon, he stood inside the Temple of Music, an ornate building at the exposition grounds, greeting a long line of well-wishers one after another in what was called a public reception. Aides had actually raised concerns about McKinley's habit of shaking hands with strangers for hours at a time, worried that the sheer exposure created security risks that were difficult to manage in crowded, chaotic settings. McKinley reportedly waved off these concerns, insisting that no one would want to harm him and that limiting access to the public would send the wrong message about what kind of leader he wanted to be. Security at the reception was thin by modern standards, a handful of guards and detectives scattered through a hall packed with hundreds of people eager to shake the president's hand. Among that crowd stood a 28-year-old man named Leon Czolgosz, a former factory worker who had become deeply influenced by anarchist ideology, particularly the writings and speeches of activist Emma Goldman, though Goldman herself had no direct connection to what Czolgosz was planning. Czolgosz had traveled to Buffalo specifically with McKinley in mind, blending into the reception line like any other citizen, hoping for a brief handshake and a moment of connection with the nation's leader. Nothing about his outward appearance or behavior set off alarms as he inched closer to the front of the line, just another face in a sea of admirers waiting for their few seconds with the president. It's a strange, almost tragic detail of history that the very quality that made McKinley beloved among ordinary Americans, his insistence on being approachable and available, was also the exact vulnerability that made this moment possible in the first place. Number 29. And speaking of details that seem almost too cinematic to be true, the weapon Czolgosz carried into that reception line was concealed in a manner so simple, it nearly defies belief given how easily it slipped past the handful of guards stationed nearby. Czolgosz had wrapped a handkerchief around his right hand, and beneath that cloth, pressed against his palm, he held a .32 caliber Ever Johnson revolver, a small, easily concealable pistol that fit neatly within the folds of fabric. To anyone glancing his way, It likely looked like nothing more than a man nursing an injured hand, or perhaps just wiping sweat away on a warm September day, an image so mundane that it barely registered as worth a second look. Some accounts suggest the heat inside the crowded temple of music that afternoon was significant enough that plenty of attendees were seen dabbing at their faces and hands with handkerchiefs, which likely made Czolgosz blend in even more seamlessly rather than draw suspicion. The security personnel present that day, including local police, exposition guards, and a few Secret Service agents assigned to McKinley, were reportedly more focused on identifying overtly suspicious behavior, sudden movements, aggressive posturing, anything that visibly deviated from the calm shuffle of well-dressed citizens waiting patiently for their turn. A man quietly holding a handkerchief to his hand simply didn't fit that profile. This detail has become one of the more chilling footnotes of the assassination because it illustrates just how unprepared early presidential security was for creative, low-tech threats. There was no metal detection, no pat-downs, no meaningful screening process of any kind for the general public filing through that reception line. The entire system relied almost entirely on visual observation and instinct, an approach that worked reasonably well against obvious threats, but proved completely inadequate against someone willing to plan carefully and disguise a weapon in something as ordinary as a piece of cloth. It's worth noting that some historians have pointed to this moment as a turning point in how seriously the government eventually came to take presidential protection, though that shift would take years to fully materialize. In the moment itself, though, nobody in that hall had any idea that the unassuming man near the front of the line, handkerchief wrapped neatly around his hand, was seconds away from changing the course of American history. Number 30, and speaking of the small human gestures that history sometimes twists into something devastating, McKinley's final act before being shot was one of pure practiced friendliness, the exact kind of gesture that had defined his entire approach to public life. As Czolgosz reached the front of the reception line, McKinley did what he had done with countless strangers before him that very afternoon. He extended his hand warmly, ready to offer a firm, welcoming handshake to yet another citizen who had waited patiently for the chance. It was an automatic, almost rehearsed motion by that point in the day, the kind of small kindness McKinley had repeated so many times that his aides likely stopped counting the handshakes hours earlier. Except this time, instead of meeting an open palm, McKinley's hand moved toward the cloth-wrapped weapon Czolgosz had kept hidden and ready. In the span of a heartbeat, Czolgosz raised the concealed revolver and fired twice at near point-blank range, the handkerchief muffling the sound just enough to cause a brief moment of confusion among nearby onlookers who weren't entirely sure at first what had happened. One bullet grazed McKinley, but the second struck him in the abdomen, lodging deep inside his body in a location that would ultimately prove impossible for doctors to fully address. McKinley, in the immediate aftermath, reportedly remained remarkably composed. Some witnesses claimed he even urged the surrounding crowd not to harm Czolgosz once he was tackled and restrained, a strange, almost gracious final instruction from a man who had just been shot by the very stranger he'd extended his hand to. The image of that moment, an act of open trust met instantly with violence, has stuck with historians and writers for generations precisely because it captures something unsettling about the vulnerability built into public leadership. McKinley didn't die immediately. He lingered for over a week as infection set in, doctors struggling with medical technology far too limited to locate or safely remove the bullet lodged near his pancreas. But the fatal moment itself had already happened in that split second inside the Temple of Music. A friendly gesture met with betrayal, a handshake that never got the chance to happen. Number 31. And speaking of small details that ended up costing McKinley his life, the first bullet that struck him turned out to be almost a cruel joke of fate, the kind of thing that made the whole tragedy feel even more avoidable in hindsight. That first shot hit a button on McKinley's coat, or possibly just grazed fabric before deflecting away, depending on which account you read, and it barely broke the skin. It left a minor wound, more of a scrape than an injury, something that under different circumstances might have been treated with nothing more than a bandage and a stiff drink. The problem was the second bullet, the one that actually mattered. The one that tore into McKinley's abdomen and lodged somewhere behind his stomach, near the pancreas and one of his kidneys, deep enough that doctors on the scene couldn't easily track its path. But here's the twist that historians love to point out. Because the first wound looked so minor, and because McKinley himself remained conscious, calm, and even talkative in the immediate aftermath, The initial impression among doctors and witnesses was that this might not be a serious situation at all. McKinley was walking, or at least being walked, shortly after the shooting. He was talking coherently. He even expressed concern for his wife's reaction more than his own condition. That composure, admirable as it was, may have inadvertently worked against him. Doctors examining him in those first critical minutes had to weigh the visible evidence in front of them. A president who didn't look like a man on the verge of death, against the unknown reality of a bullet buried somewhere inside his body, that they couldn't see and couldn't immediately locate. Some medical historians argue that this misleading first impression shaped the pace and tone of the emergency response, that if McKinley had immediately collapsed or shown more dramatic signs of distress, the surgical team might have moved faster or made different choices about how aggressively to search for that second, far more dangerous bullet. It's an unsettling thought that the very thing which might have saved him, a sense of urgency matching the true severity of the wound, was masked by his own stoicism and the deceptively minor nature of that first shot. Whether that theory fully explains what followed is still debated, but it's one of the eerie little ironies of the whole event, that the wound everyone could see mattered so little, and the wound nobody could see was the one that would ultimately kill him. Number 32, and speaking of tools that could have changed everything but somehow never got used. There was in fact an X-ray machine on the exposition grounds that day, sitting almost within walking distance of the room where McKinley lay wounded and struggling. The Pan American Exposition, remember, was designed to showcase cutting-edge technology and progress, and X-ray machines were still a novelty in 1901, impressive enough to be displayed as an exhibit demonstrating the marvels of modern science. Doctors treating McKinley reportedly discussed the possibility of using it to locate the bullet still buried somewhere inside him, since without that information, surgery to remove it amounted to little more than educated guesswork. And yet, for reasons that still puzzle historians today, the machine was never used. Some accounts suggest the doctors were simply unfamiliar with the device and uncertain how reliable or safe it actually was, since X-ray technology was so new that even trained physicians had limited practical experience with it. Others point to concerns about moving the president, or worries that the procedure itself might do more harm than good given how experimental the technology still seemed at the time. There's also a theory, difficult to confirm but frequently repeated, that the machine on display wasn't even fully operational, more of a demonstration piece than a functioning medical tool ready for real emergency use. Whatever the exact reason, the result was the same. Surgeons operated on McKinley without ever locating the second bullet, closing him up while it remained lodged somewhere inside his body, a decision that in retrospect looks almost unthinkable given the resources technically available just steps away. It's the kind of historical detail that tends to stick with people. The idea that the tool which might have saved a president's life was sitting nearby the entire time, gleaming as a symbol of American technological progress, while inside a nearby room, doctors worked with their hands and instincts instead. Some historians frame it as an early lesson in the gap between having technology available and actually knowing how to trust and apply it under pressure, a gap that in this case may have proven fatal. Number 33, and speaking of moments that seemed hopeful right before everything fell apart, McKinley's condition actually appeared to improve in the days immediately following the shooting, giving doctors, his family, and the entire country genuine reason for optimism. His color returned, his appetite came back. He was reportedly able to sit up, speak clearly, and even joke gently with those around him, prompting doctors to release cautiously positive updates to a nation anxiously following every detail in the newspapers. For a brief window of time, it seemed as though the president might actually pull through, that the surgery, imperfect as it was, had done enough to save him despite that lingering, unlocated bullet. Then, just as quickly as that optimism had built, it began to unravel. Gangrene set in around the wound, a severe bacterial infection that spread through tissue weakened by the injury and the surgery itself, made worse by medical practices of the era that were still catching up with basic understandings of sterilization and infection control. McKinley's condition deteriorated rapidly once the infection took hold, and by the time doctors recognized how serious it had become, there was little they could do. Some medical historians argue that earlier detection of the infection, or a different approach to wound care in the days following surgery, might have changed the outcome entirely, though that remains speculation given the limits of medicine at the time. What's certain is that the illusion of recovery, That brief stretch of hopeful days when it seemed McKinley might survive made his eventual decline all the more shocking to a public that had been told things were improving. He died on September 14th, just over a week after being shot, a death that felt almost like a bait and switch to a nation that had allowed itself to believe the worst was over. Number 34. And speaking of moments when the machinery of American government suddenly had to move at breakneck speed, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt's whereabouts when McKinley took that final turn for the worst read, almost like something out of an adventure novel rather than a footnote in presidential history. Roosevelt had been vacationing in the Adirondack Mountains, camping and hiking with his family in a remote area far removed from telegraph lines and railway stations, precisely the kind of rugged wilderness retreat he was famous for enjoying. When McKinley initially seemed to be recovering after the shooting, Roosevelt had actually left Buffalo to continue his vacation, trusting the optimistic reports that suggested the president was on the mend. That decision, reasonable at the time given the information available, meant that when McKinley's condition suddenly collapsed due to the infection spreading through his system, the man next in line for the presidency was somewhere on a mountain, effectively unreachable by any fast or reliable method of communication. Messengers were dispatched to track him down, a process that involved runners, horses, and finally a hair-raising nighttime carriage ride down treacherous mountain roads to reach the nearest train station. Some accounts describe the driver pushing the horses at a dangerous pace through darkness and rough terrain, risking an accident that could have created an entirely different constitutional crisis if Roosevelt himself had been injured or killed getting down from the mountain. Once he reached the railway, a special train was arranged to rush him toward Buffalo, but by the time he actually arrived, McKinley had already died. The image of Roosevelt racing down from a wilderness campsite to accept the presidency captures something almost symbolic about the transition. The rugged outdoorsman being summoned from nature into the highest office in the land under the worst possible circumstances. It also highlights just how unprepared the country's communication and succession systems were for handling a rapid crisis, a vulnerability that wouldn't be seriously addressed for decades afterward. Historians sometimes point to this frantic scramble as an early argument for why presidents and vice presidents needed better contingency planning, though it would take several more assassinations and near misses before those lessons were fully absorbed into how the government operated. Number 35, and speaking of unusual settings for what should have been a solemn and carefully staged constitutional moment, Theodore Roosevelt didn't take his presidential oath in a grand government building or even in Washington. Instead, once he finally arrived in Buffalo, the ceremony took place in a private home, the Ansley Wilcox House, borrowed for the occasion because there simply wasn't time or infrastructure in place for anything more formal. On September 14, 1901, just hours after McKinley's death, Roosevelt stood in the library of that house and took the oath of office in front of a small group of witnesses, a stark contrast to the elaborate inaugurations most Americans associated with the transfer of presidential power. There was no cheering crowd, no parade, no carefully rehearsed speech crafted over weeks, just a hastily arranged gathering reflecting the genuine uncertainty and grief surrounding the moment. Some historians note that Roosevelt himself seemed acutely aware of how unusual the circumstances were, reportedly choosing his words carefully to project stability and continuity precisely because the setting itself felt so improvised and unofficial. The choice of a private residence rather than a courthouse or government office has occasionally been framed as evidence of just how unprepared the country's institutions were for a sudden transfer of power outside the normal electoral cycle. Though it's worth noting that this kind of informal, rapid ceremony wasn't unprecedented given the country's earlier experiences with presidential deaths. Still, there's something almost jarring about imagining the leader of a rapidly industrializing global power taking his oath in someone else's library, rather than a hall built for such occasions. The Ansley Wilcox House still stands today, preserved as a historic site precisely because of that single afternoon, a reminder that some of the most consequential moments in a nation's history can unfold in surprisingly modest, almost accidental locations. Number 36, and speaking of proceedings that moved with startling speed given the gravity of what was being decided, Leon Czolgosz's trial for the murder of President McKinley was over almost before it began. The entire trial lasted a mere 8 hours spread across 2 days, an astonishingly brief window considering the defendant was accused of assassinating a sitting president in front of dozens of witnesses. Czolgosz's court-appointed attorneys reportedly offered little in the way of a vigorous defense, partly because Czolgosz himself showed almost no interest in defending his own actions, having confessed readily and repeatedly to the shooting without expressing any remorse. Some legal historians and commentators have since raised questions about whether the speed of the trial reflected the overwhelming and largely undisputed evidence against him, or whether public outrage and the desire for swift justice simply overwhelmed any meaningful examination of his mental state or motivations. The jury took only about half an hour to deliberate before returning a guilty verdict, a timeline that today would almost certainly raise concerns about due process in a capital case, though it was less unusual by the standards of the era. Czolgosz was sentenced to death and executed by electric chair less than 2 months after the shooting, a pace of justice that left little room for the kind of extended legal battles or appeals that would accompany similar cases in later decades. Whether that speed reflected genuine confidence in an open and shut case, or a system eager to close the book quickly on a traumatic national event, remains a subject some historians continue to debate. What's clear is that the brief trial did little to satisfy lingering questions about Czolgosz's motivations, his mental health, or whether anyone else had influenced or assisted him, questions that would linger unanswered long after his execution. Number 37. And speaking of institutions that only got serious about their job after a president was already dead, the Secret Service's transformation from a niche anti-counterfeiting agency into the president's personal bodyguard detail happened largely because of what occurred in Buffalo. Most people assume the Secret Service was always in the business of protecting presidents, but that's not remotely true. The agency was created back in 1865, and its original mission had nothing to do with guarding anyone. It existed to hunt down counterfeiters who were flooding the post-Civil War economy with fake currency. Presidential protection wasn't even part of the conversation. In fact, by the time McKinley took office, presidents wandered around with almost no security at all. McKinley himself was famous for hosting public receptions where ordinary citizens could walk right up and shake his hand, which is exactly the kind of open access that made it trivially easy for Leon Czolgosz to get close enough to fire 2 shots at point-blank range. There were a couple of Secret Service agents present that day at the Pan American Exposition, but their presence was more informal courtesy than dedicated protective strategy, and it clearly wasn't enough. McKinley became the 3rd president assassinated in less than 40 years, following Lincoln and Garfield, and you'd think that pattern alone would have triggered immediate reform. It didn't happen overnight. Congress moved with its usual glacial pace, but the shock of losing yet another sitting president finally pushed lawmakers toward action. In 1902, Congress began quietly funding Secret Service agents to protect the president on an informal basis, treating it almost like a budget line item rather than a formal legal mandate. It took until 1906 for Congress to actually pass legislation making presidential protection an official, permanent duty of the Secret Service, transforming the agency's core mission in the process. Even then, the resources devoted to the job were laughably thin by modern standards, just a handful of agents responsible for guarding the most powerful person in the country. It would take further tragedies, including additional threats against Woodrow Wilson, and eventually the assassination of John F. Kennedy decades later, to expand the agency into the sprawling, heavily funded protective operation we recognize today, complete with advanced teams, counter-sniper units, and coordination with local law enforcement. So in a strange way, McKinley's death didn't just end his presidency. It rewrote the job description of an entire federal agency, though it's worth remembering that even a fully funded, officially mandated Secret Service would still fail to prevent the killing of a president just over 6 decades later, proving that institutional reform, however necessary, is never quite a guarantee against history repeating itself. Number 38. And speaking of decisions made in the days before a presidential visit that would later become the subject of endless speculation, the last-minute adjustment to President Kennedy's motorcade route through Dallas has fueled theories for over 60 years. The original plan for the November 1963 visit had the motorcade taking a more direct path through downtown Dallas toward the Trade Mart, where Kennedy was scheduled to deliver a lunchtime speech to local business leaders. But in the days leading up to the visit, the route was adjusted, and that adjustment included a turn onto Elm Street, directly in front of the Texas School Book Depository, and directly into Dealey Plaza. This detail has become one of the most scrutinized footnotes in the entire assassination story, largely because it placed the president's car in a position where it had to slow down significantly to navigate the turn, creating what many researchers describe as an unusually vulnerable moment for anyone positioned above the street with a clear line of sight. Some who study the assassination closely have pointed to this route change as suspicious, asking why officials would choose a path that required slowing the motorcade right in front of a building with upper-floor windows overlooking the street. It's an idea that has circulated in various forms for decades, often woven into broader theories about conspiracy and foreknowledge. The more grounded explanation offered by historians is considerably less dramatic. The route change was reportedly made for practical logistical reasons, primarily to accommodate the layout of streets leading to the Trade Mart, and it wasn't some closely guarded secret sprung on the public at the last second. The Dallas Morning News had actually published the planned motorcade route, including the Elm Street turn, in the newspaper days before Kennedy's arrival, meaning anyone in the city, including a potential shooter, could have known exactly where the motorcade would pass, without needing any inside information at all. That detail tends to get lost in more elaborate theories about the route being secretly altered to benefit a particular vantage point. Still, the fact that the route was public knowledge doesn't fully answer every question people have raised over the decades about who had input into the final path, and why certain alternatives weren't chosen instead. What's certain is that the specific mechanics of that turn, requiring the presidential limousine to slow to roughly 11 miles per hour, created a narrow window of vulnerability that became central to everything that unfolded next in Dealey Plaza. Number 39, and speaking of small weather-related decisions that ended up carrying enormous historical weight, the choice to keep President Kennedy's limousine open-topped on the morning of November 22nd has been debated for just as long as the motorcade route itself. Dallas had seen rain earlier that morning, and there was real discussion among the Secret Service and Kennedy's staff about whether to use the plastic bubble top that could be fitted onto the presidential limousine in case of bad weather. That bubble top, despite what many people assume, wasn't bulletproof or even particularly sturdy. It was designed purely to keep rain off the passengers, offering essentially zero protection against anything more serious than a drizzle. By the time the motorcade was actually ready to depart, the skies over Dallas had cleared, and with clear weather in place, the decision was made to leave the top off entirely, allowing crowds along the route to see the President and First Lady clearly, which was very much the point of a public motorcade in the first place. The idea of presidential visibility mattered enormously in that era. Kennedy was known for wanting direct contact with crowds, and shielding him behind glass or plastic, especially on a sunny day, would have run counter to the entire purpose of a public appearance designed to generate goodwill and enthusiasm ahead of the following year's election. Some accounts suggest Kennedy himself had expressed a preference for skipping the bubble top whenever weather allowed, valuing that visible connection with supporters lining the streets. In hindsight, given what happened just minutes later in Dealey Plaza, this seemingly minor logistical choice has taken on outsized significance, prompting endless speculation about whether an enclosed vehicle might have altered the outcome. Even though the bubble top's lack of actual armor means most experts agree it likely wouldn't have changed much of anything regarding the rifle fire. What the decision did reveal was a broader truth about presidential protection at the time, still built more around visibility and public accessibility than around hardened defensive measures against a determined and well-positioned shooter. In the aftermath, this exact tension between openness and safety prompted a serious re-examination of protective protocols, leading to permanent changes in how future presidents would travel through crowded, unpredictable urban environments. Number 40, and speaking of buildings that would become permanently linked to one afternoon in American history, the Texas School Book Depository sat along the motorcade route almost by coincidence, yet it would end up defining Dealey Plaza for the rest of time. The building itself was nothing special. It was a 7-story warehouse used to store and distribute textbooks to schools across the region, staffed by workers who filled orders, packed boxes, and generally went about their business with zero awareness that history was about to unfold right outside their windows. Lee Harvey Oswald had started working there just over a month before Kennedy's visit, landing the job through a connection made by his wife's friend, Ruth Payne. It was an ordinary hire for an ordinary warehouse job, filling book orders for around $1.25 an hour. Nobody at the depository thought twice about Oswald's presence there. He kept mostly to himself, ate lunch alone, and didn't draw much attention from coworkers who barely remembered him when investigators started asking questions afterward. What made the building significant wasn't Oswald's job title. It was the geography, The depository sat right at the corner where Houston Street met Elm Street, directly along the path the motorcade was scheduled to take as it made that infamous slow turn toward the triple underpass. Anyone positioned on the upper floors would have had a clear, almost unobstructed view down Elm Street as the president's limousine crawled past at a walking pace. Some researchers have pointed out just how convenient this vantage point was, especially given that Oswald had only recently started working there, raising questions about whether the timing was coincidental or whether something more deliberate was at play. Others note that Oswald's employment predated the announcement of the specific motorcade route, which weakens the idea that he sought out the job specifically to be in position that day. Still, the coincidence of an employee with pro-Castro sympathies and a documented history of erratic behavior happening to work in the one building offering a perfect sightline has fueled decades of speculation. Whatever the explanation, the depository's role in the story was cemented within minutes of the shooting. Witnesses in Dealey Plaza reported seeing movement in the windows on the upper floors, and police descended on the building almost immediately afterward, sealing exits and beginning a search that would uncover evidence linking directly back to the 6th floor. The depository has since become something of an involuntary monument, a place forever associated with tragedy rather than textbooks. It now houses a museum dedicated entirely to the assassination, drawing visitors from around the world who stand at the same windows and try to imagine that same sightline down Elm Street, more than 60 years after an ordinary warehouse became one of the most studied crime scenes in American history. Number 41. And speaking of physical evidence that investigators moved quickly to secure once the shooting stopped, the discovery of a rifle on the 6th floor of the depository became one of the central pieces of the entire case against Oswald. Within about 45 minutes of the shots being fired, Dallas police searching the building found a bolt-action Mannlicher Carcano rifle hidden behind a stack of boxes near a window on the southeast corner of the 6th floor, the same general area where witnesses had reported seeing movement just before the shooting began. The rifle was Italian-made, a surplus military weapon that had actually been ordered by Oswald through the mail under an alias several months earlier, purchased from a mail-order sporting goods company for less than $20. Investigators traced the weapon's serial number directly back to that purchase, connecting it to Oswald through paperwork that seemed almost too neatly documented for some later researchers, who found it curious that a supposedly impulsive lone gunman had left such a clear paper trail. Alongside the rifle, investigators found a makeshift sniper's perch, boxes arranged near the window that appeared to have been positioned deliberately, along with spent shell casings scattered nearby that matched the rifle's caliber. Fingerprint evidence connecting Oswald to the rifle and to the boxes became a significant part of the case, though the quality and handling of that evidence has been scrutinized extensively over the decades by people questioning whether the investigation moved too quickly or too sloppily in the chaotic hours after the shooting. The Mannlicher Carcano itself became a subject of intense debate almost immediately, with some ballistics experts and researchers questioning whether the rifle's bolt-action mechanism, which required manual cycling between shots, could realistically be fired accurately 3 times within the roughly 6-second window investigators believe the shooting took place in. Test firings conducted afterward produced mixed results, with some marksmen struggling to replicate the speed and accuracy attributed to Oswald that day, while others managed it without much difficulty. This gap between what was physically demonstrated and what official investigations concluded has remained one of the more persistent points of contention among people who study the case, feeding theories about additional shooters or additional weapons that were never recovered. The Warren Commission ultimately concluded that the rifle found on the 6th floor was the weapon used in the assassination and that Oswald acted alone in firing it, but the physical evidence surrounding that rifle, how it was found, how quickly it was matched to Oswald, and whether it could have functioned the way official accounts describe, continues to generate debate among historians, researchers, and amateur investigators who have spent decades poring over ballistics reports and crime scene photographs, looking for answers that satisfy every lingering question. Number 42. And speaking of evidence that exists purely by accident, one dressmaker named Abraham Zapruder happened to bring his home movie camera to Dealey Plaza that morning, and in doing so created what would become the single most scrutinized piece of film in American history. Zapruder ran a clothing manufacturing business in Dallas and had originally left his camera at home that day, only to return for it after deciding he wanted footage of the president's visit for his own personal collection. He set up on a small concrete pedestal near the grassy knoll, capturing roughly 26 seconds of silent color film using a Bell and Howell home movie camera, footage that happened to include the exact moment the fatal shot struck the president. The film shows the motorcade approaching, then Kennedy reacting to what appears to be an initial wound, followed by the devastating final shot that ends the sequence in a way that has haunted viewers for over 60 years. Zapruder reportedly sold the film to Life magazine for a substantial sum shortly after the assassination, and for years afterward, public access to the actual footage remained limited, with only still frames circulating widely, while the moving footage itself stayed largely out of public view until later decades. When the full film eventually became more widely accessible, it turned into the foundation for nearly every serious analysis of the assassination that followed, examined frame by investigators, researchers, and amateur enthusiasts alike, all searching for clues about shot timing, the number of shots fired, and the president's exact head movement in the film's most infamous and disturbing frame. That particular frame has become a flashpoint for debate about the direction the fatal shot came from, with some researchers arguing the visible movement suggests a shot from the front rather than from behind, directly challenging the official conclusion that all shots originated from the depository. Others maintain that the movement is consistent with the rear shot, once accounting for neurological response and camera distortion. The film's frame rate and any potential gaps or splices have also been debated extensively, with some researchers alleging possible tampering over the years, though no conclusive proof of alteration has ever been widely accepted. What remains undisputed is the film's historical weight. It transformed an ordinary bystander's home movie into perhaps the most analyzed piece of visual evidence in the world, studied in university courses, dissected in documentaries, and referenced constantly whenever new theories about the assassination surface. Zapruder himself was reportedly devastated by what he had captured, having unknowingly filmed the death of a president, while simply trying to preserve a happy memory of a presidential visit to his hometown. Number 43. And speaking of that final horrifying frame captured on Zapruder's film, the motorcade's route ended just minutes later at Parkland Memorial Hospital, where doctors rushed to save a president who had already suffered catastrophic injuries. Kennedy was brought into Trauma Room 1, a modestly sized emergency space that had no idea it was about to become one of the most examined rooms in American history. The medical team that day included Dr. Malcolm Perry, Dr. Charles Carrico, and several others who worked frantically to establish an airway, perform a tracheotomy, and attempt to control bleeding, all while realizing almost immediately that the wounds were beyond survivable. Witnesses in the room described a scene of controlled chaos, doctors moving with practiced urgency even as the Secret Service and Kennedy's own aides stood nearby in stunned disbelief. Governor John Connally, who had also been struck during the shooting, was being treated simultaneously in a nearby trauma bay, adding to the surreal intensity of that afternoon inside Parkland's emergency wing. Doctors in the room later gave differing accounts of the wounds they observed, some describing what appeared to be an entry wound in the front of the president's throat, which some researchers have argued suggests a shot from the front rather than from behind. Others have pointed out that a tracheotomy incision performed during emergency treatment could easily explain that appearance without requiring any shot from a different direction at all. These competing interpretations became part of a much larger debate about the number and origin of the shots fired that day, a debate that has never fully settled despite decades of analysis. Doctors also noted a large wound to the back of the president's head, observations that would later be compared, sometimes uneasily, against the autopsy findings produced hours afterward once the body had been moved elsewhere. Some Parkland physicians recalled seeing a wound in a slightly different location than what the official autopsy report eventually described, a discrepancy that has fueled ongoing speculation among researchers who study the case closely. Whether these differences stemmed from the fast, high-stress nature of emergency treatment, incomplete examination in the moment, or something else entirely, remains a matter of interpretation rather than settled fact. What is certain is that inside Trauma Room 1, doctors worked as hard as any medical team could to save a patient whose injuries were simply too severe. Officially, Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, though many of the doctors present understood almost from the first moment they saw him that there was little realistic hope. The room itself became something of a historical footnote afterward, eventually converted and later removed entirely as the hospital underwent renovations, though its layout and contents have been recreated and referenced endlessly in books, documentaries, and museum exhibits dedicated to piecing together exactly what happened in those final desperate minutes. Nurses and staff who were present that day carried the memory for the rest of their lives, describing an atmosphere heavy with disbelief as word spread through the hospital that the President of the United States lay dying just down the hall from ordinary patients receiving ordinary care. For many of the medical personnel involved, the events of that afternoon became a defining moment they would be asked to recount again and again for decades, testifying before commissions, sitting for interviews, and revisiting memories that never fully faded. Trauma Room 1 at Parkland Memorial Hospital stands as one of the emotional epicenters of the entire tragedy, a small ordinary space that briefly held the full weight of a shocked nation's hopes for a miracle that never came. Number 44. And speaking of the differing accounts that emerged from that emergency room, those same discrepancies would only deepen once attention turned to the president's official autopsy, conducted later that evening at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, rather than in Dallas, where the shooting actually occurred. The decision to move the body and perform the autopsy under military supervision rather than through the standard local process has itself become a point of ongoing discussion, with some researchers arguing that jurisdictional confusion and the emotional urgency of the moment explain the choice, while others suggest it created conditions ripe for procedural shortcuts. The autopsy was conducted under unusual circumstances, reportedly rushed, disorganized at times, and performed by pathologists who some critics argue lacked the specific forensic experience typically required for a gunshot wound investigation of this complexity. Handwritten notes were destroyed and rewritten, a decision the doctors involved later explained as an attempt to produce a cleaner official record, though the destruction of original documentation has understandably raised questions among researchers looking for consistency across every version of events. Photographs and X-rays taken during the autopsy have also become subjects of intense scrutiny, with some analysts arguing that certain images appear inconsistent with witness descriptions from Parkland, while others maintain that lighting, angle, and the nature of the injuries themselves account for any apparent differences. The location and size of the head wound in particular has remained one of the most debated details across the decades, discussed and re-examined by medical experts, government panels, and independent researchers who have each reached their own conclusions using the same limited set of surviving materials. Some later government reviews, including a House committee investigation conducted in the late 1970s, revisited the autopsy evidence and reached conclusions that differed in certain respects from the original findings, adding yet another layer of complexity rather than settling the matter cleanly. The chain of custody for certain physical evidence, including tissue samples and specific photographs, has also been questioned over the years, with some materials reportedly missing from official archives entirely. None of this is presented as proof of any particular alternative theory, but rather as an illustration of how many unresolved threads remain woven through what should have been the most straightforward forensic documentation of the entire case. For decades, researchers, doctors, and government panels have pored over what evidence does survive, comparing measurements, angles, and descriptions in an effort to reconcile the different accounts. Whether these inconsistencies point to human error under extraordinary pressure or something more deliberate remains, like so much of this case, a matter of ongoing debate rather than settled history, and the autopsy records continue to be requested, studied, and argued over by people determined to understand exactly what happened to President Kennedy in those final examinations. Number 45. And speaking of decisions made in the middle of unimaginable chaos, few moments capture the sheer disorientation of that day quite like the scene aboard Air Force One, parked on the tarmac at Dallas Love Field, where Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president less than 2 hours after Kennedy's death was officially announced. The swearing-in took place inside the cramped confines of the presidential aircraft rather than at any formal government building, reflecting both the urgency of establishing clear presidential authority and the genuine uncertainty about what exactly had just happened in Dealey Plaza. Federal Judge Sarah Hughes, a longtime friend of Johnson's from Texas, administered the oath, making her the first and only woman to ever swear in an American president. The brief ceremony was crowded and somber, with Jacqueline Kennedy standing beside Johnson, still wearing the pink suit stained from the events of that afternoon, a detail she reportedly insisted on keeping on as a visible reminder of what had just occurred. Photographs from the swearing-in show a room full of exhausted, shell-shocked officials trying to maintain some sense of order and continuity of government during a moment when nobody fully understood the scope of what they were dealing with. Some researchers have pointed to the speed of the swearing in as evidence of appropriate constitutional urgency, ensuring there was no gap in presidential authority during a moment of national crisis. Others have raised questions about why the ceremony took place so quickly and in such an unusual location, rather than waiting until officials returned to Washington. Though most historians view the decision as a practical response to genuine uncertainty about ongoing threats rather than anything more suspicious. There were legitimate fears in those early hours that the assassination might be part of a broader conspiracy or attack, and establishing a clear, undisputed presidential successor as quickly as possible was seen as essential to maintaining stability. Once the oath was administered, Air Force One departed for Washington, carrying both the new president and Kennedy's casket, a flight described by those aboard as almost unbearably quiet given everything that had just unfolded. Johnson's presidency effectively began not in a grand ceremonial hall, but inside a metal tube sitting on a runway in Texas, surrounded by grieving aides, a blood-stained widow, and the pressing need to reassure an anxious country that its government remained intact. The image of that swearing in has become one of the defining visuals of the entire tragedy, a quiet, almost intimate moment squeezed between overwhelming grief and the unstoppable machinery of government succession. It remains a powerful reminder of just how quickly the nation had to adapt, transferring power in the span of hours rather than the carefully choreographed transitions Americans typically expect, all while investigators back in Dallas were only just beginning the long process of trying to understand exactly what had happened that afternoon. Number 46. And speaking of that pink suit Jacqueline Kennedy refused to remove during the swearing-in ceremony, the story of that garment extends far beyond the tarmac at Dallas Love Field and reveals something remarkable about grief, symbolism, and the deliberate choices made by a woman thrust into unimaginable trauma in front of the entire world. The suit itself was a wool boucle design in a soft rose pink, styled after a Chanel silhouette but actually made domestically by a New York-based company, chosen that morning as a bright, optimistic outfit meant to project warmth and approachability during what was supposed to be a routine political visit to Texas. By the time Air Force One touched down in Washington that evening, the suit told an entirely different story, stained with blood across the skirt and jacket, a devastating physical record of exactly what had happened in Dealey Plaza only hours earlier. Kennedy's aides and staff gently suggested she change before facing the cameras and crowds waiting in Washington, but she refused, reportedly telling those around her that she wanted people to see what they had done to her husband. That decision, made in the rawest moments of shock and sorrow, transformed a simple piece of clothing into one of the most haunting visual symbols of the entire tragedy. An unspoken statement broadcast to a grieving nation without a single word being said. Photographs and film footage from that day show her standing beside Lyndon Johnson during his swearing-in, still wearing the suit, her expression a mixture of exhaustion, devastation, and steely composure that many historians argue set the tone for how the country itself would process the days of mourning that followed. After returning to the White House, Kennedy changed out of the suit, and from that point forward, it essentially disappeared from public view, packed away rather than cleaned or altered in any way. Her mother reportedly wanted to have the bloodstains removed, but Kennedy refused that request as well, insisting the suit remain exactly as it was, a decision that speaks to how deeply she understood the historical weight of that specific piece of fabric. The suit eventually made its way into the possession of the National Archives, donated by Kennedy's daughter Caroline in 2003, but with an unusual and striking condition attached to the donation. The suit was sealed away with a formal agreement stating it cannot be publicly displayed until the year 2103, a full century after the assassination itself. It remains stored today in a climate-controlled, undisclosed facility, still stained, still unaltered, waiting in the dark for a future generation to eventually see it. Some conservators and archivists have quietly confirmed that the suit continues to deteriorate slowly, despite careful preservation efforts, raising real questions about whether it will even survive intact long enough to reach that distant unveiling date. For now, the pink suit exists mostly as an idea, a preserved fragment of unbearable grief locked away from public consumption, respected as something almost too painful and too intimate to display casually. It stands as one of the most quietly powerful artifacts connected to the entire assassination, not because of any grand mystery attached to it, but because of the simple, devastating choice one grieving widow made to let the physical evidence of violence speak for itself. Number 47. And speaking of physical evidence tied directly to that violent afternoon, The manhunt for the man accused of pulling the trigger moved with startling speed once witnesses and police began piecing together where the shots had actually come from. Lee Harvey Oswald, an employee at the Texas School Book Depository, left the building shortly after the shooting and made his way through downtown Dallas on foot, eventually boarding a bus, then a taxi, before returning briefly to his rooming house and changing his jacket. Roughly 45 minutes after the shooting, Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit was shot and killed a few miles away, an event that many researchers argue is directly connected to Oswald's continued movement through the city that afternoon. Though the exact sequence and motivations behind that shooting remain debated among those who have studied the case closely. Witnesses reported seeing a man matching Oswald's description, fleeing the scene of Tippit's shooting on foot, ducking between buildings, and eventually slipping into the Texas Theater, a modest movie house showing a war film to a sparse afternoon audience, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding just blocks away. A shoe store clerk named Johnny Brewer noticed a suspicious man loitering near his storefront shortly before the man slipped into the theater without paying for a ticket. Brewer alerted the theater's ticket clerk, Julia Postal, who called Dallas police, setting into motion the final chapter of one of the most consequential manhunts in American history. Officers surrounded the theater and entered quietly, working their way through the aisles as the film continued playing overhead. Officer Nick McDonald approached a man sitting near the back of the theater, and according to official accounts, a brief but violent struggle broke out, with Oswald allegedly attempting to draw a revolver before officers wrestled him into custody. The entire sequence of events, from the shots fired in Dealey Plaza to Oswald's arrest inside that darkened theater, took place in roughly 80 minutes, an astonishingly compressed timeline for what would become one of the most examined criminal investigations of the 20th century. Oswald was taken into custody, shouting that he was being railroaded, a phrase that would echo through decades of debate about his guilt, his motivations, and whether he acted entirely alone. The Texas Theater itself still stands today, largely preserved, drawing visitors and historians curious to stand in the exact spot where the accused assassin was finally apprehended. For many researchers, the speed and specific circumstances of that arrest raised additional questions rather than settling them, particularly regarding Oswald's movements and motivations in those chaotic 80 minutes, questions that remain part of the broader, unresolved puzzle surrounding the assassination as a whole. Number 48. And speaking of Oswald's arrest raising more questions than it answered, none of those questions would ever receive a clear resolution, because 2 days later, in front of live television cameras broadcasting to a stunned national audience, Oswald was shot and killed before he could ever stand trial. On November 24, 1963, as Dallas police prepared to transfer Oswald from the city jail to the county jail, reporters and camera crews crowded the basement of police headquarters, documenting what was expected to be a routine procedural transfer. Instead, as Oswald was escorted through the crowd in handcuffs, a local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby stepped forward and fired a single shot into Oswald's abdomen at close range, an act captured live on television and instantly seared into the memory of everyone watching. Oswald was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the very same hospital where President Kennedy had been declared dead just 2 days earlier, and despite emergency surgery, he died from his injuries shortly afterward. Ruby was immediately subdued and arrested at the scene, and the shooting became the first murder ever broadcast live on national television, an almost unbelievable turn of events layered directly on top of an already unbearable national tragedy. Ruby's motivations have been debated ever since, with his own explanations shifting somewhat over time. He claimed he acted out of grief and outrage on behalf of the Kennedy family, specifically stating he wanted to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the pain of having to return to Dallas and testify at a public trial. Some researchers have taken that explanation largely at face value, viewing Ruby as an emotionally volatile figure who impulsively decided to take matters into his own hands. Others have pointed to Ruby's documented connections to organized crime figures and questioned whether his actions were somehow connected to a broader effort to silence Oswald before he could reveal additional information, though no conclusive evidence has ever definitively proven a coordinated plot. Ruby was convicted of murder in 1964 and sentenced to death, though that conviction was later overturned on appeal due to procedural issues, and before a new trial could take place, Ruby was diagnosed with cancer and died in prison in January 1967. His death effectively closed off any further opportunity to fully clarify his motivations or possible connections beyond what was already known. The shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald remains one of the most bizarre and consequential moments connected to the entire assassination story, eliminating the only person ever formally charged with killing the president, and ensuring that countless questions about motive, involvement, and possible conspiracy would remain permanently unanswered, debated endlessly by historians, researchers, and everyday Americans for generations to come. Number 49. And speaking of questions that would remain permanently unanswered after Ruby's death, the task of providing official answers fell to a commission specifically created to investigate the assassination and calm a nation desperate for explanations. Just 1 week after President Kennedy's death, President Lyndon Johnson established what became known as the Warren Commission, named after its chairman, Chief Justice Earl Warren, who reportedly accepted the role reluctantly after Johnson personally pressured him, arguing that the credibility of the investigation depended on someone of Warren's stature leading it. The commission included several other prominent figures, among them future President Gerald Ford, then a congressman from Michigan, along with a mix of senators, representatives, and legal experts tasked with reviewing an enormous volume of evidence in a relatively compressed period of time. Johnson's stated goal was straightforward. He wanted to prevent wild theories from spreading both domestically and internationally, particularly concerns that the Soviet Union or Cuba might be blamed without solid proof, a scenario many feared could escalate into a far more dangerous confrontation during an already tense Cold War atmosphere. The commission spent roughly 10 months examining testimony from Oyablonko, over 500 witnesses, reviewing FBI and CIA reports, analyzing the Zapruder film frame by frame, and attempting to reconstruct the exact sequence of shots fired in Dealey Plaza. In September 1964, the commission released its final report, running well over 800 pages, concluding that Lee Harvey Oswald acted entirely alone, firing 3 shots from the 6th-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository, and that there was no evidence of a broader conspiracy involving any foreign government, domestic organization, or additional shooters. The report also concluded that Jack Ruby acted independently when he killed Oswald, finding no evidence linking Ruby's actions to organized crime or any coordinated effort to silence Oswald before he could speak further. On the surface, the report appeared to offer the closure the nation desperately wanted, a clear narrative with a lone gunman and a tragic, almost random act of violence that altered the course of American history. Beneath that surface, however, the report generated immediate skepticism from journalists, researchers, and even some individuals who had worked closely with the investigation itself. Central to much of the doubt was what became known as the single bullet theory. The idea that one bullet passed through President Kennedy's neck and then continued on to strike Texas Governor John Connally, who was riding in the same vehicle, causing multiple wounds before the bullet was later found in relatively pristine condition on a hospital stretcher. Critics argued the trajectory required for that single bullet to cause all of the documented injuries seemed almost impossibly precise, while supporters of the commission's findings maintained that detailed ballistic and medical analysis supported the conclusion. Questions were also raised about the handling of physical evidence, including concerns about the chain of custody for certain materials, apparent inconsistencies in early witness statements describing shots coming from multiple directions, and the fact that some witnesses who described hearing shots from the grassy knoll area were given less weight in the final report than those whose testimony supported the lone gunman conclusion. Additional scrutiny emerged regarding the commission's limited access to certain intelligence information, with later investigations revealing that the CIA and FBI had withheld some details about Oswald's background, including his prior contact with Soviet and Cuban officials. Information some researchers argue might have altered the scope or direction of the original investigation had it been fully disclosed at the time. Over the following decades, subsequent government investigations, most notably the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s, re-examined much of the original evidence using improved forensic techniques, ultimately suggesting in their own report that acoustic analysis indicated a possible 4th shot, raising the possibility of a second shooter, though that particular acoustic evidence was later challenged and largely discredited by subsequent scientific review. This back and forth between competing investigations, each reaching somewhat different conclusions using the same underlying evidence, has fueled decades of continued debate, rather than settling the matter definitively for everyone involved. It is worth noting that many historians and researchers who have spent careers studying the assassination continue to support the Warren Commission's core conclusion that Oswald acted alone, arguing that much of the ongoing skepticism stems from natural human difficulty accepting that such a consequential historical event could result from the actions of a single, relatively obscure individual rather than some larger, more organized force. Others maintain that the unresolved inconsistencies, missing records, and unanswered procedural questions leave enough reasonable doubt that firm certainty either way remains elusive, even 6 decades later. What remains clear is that the Warren Commission's report, whatever its accuracy, failed to fully close the book on the assassination in the way Johnson and its members had hoped, instead becoming itself a permanent subject of historical debate, endlessly re-examined, criticized, defended, and reinterpreted by each new generation of researchers approaching the available evidence with their own set of questions. Number 50, and speaking of each new generation approaching the available evidence with their own questions, that ongoing curiosity eventually led directly to a significant piece of legislation designed to address one of the most persistent complaints surrounding the entire case: the sheer volume of records that remained sealed, classified, or otherwise inaccessible to the public for decades after the assassination itself. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, journalists, historians, and independent researchers repeatedly ran into walls when attempting to access government files related to the assassination, encountering redacted documents, entire sealed collections, and bureaucratic resistance that only deepened public suspicion that something significant was being deliberately withheld. That frustration reached a cultural tipping point in 1991 with the release of Oliver Stone's film JFK, a dramatized and heavily debated portrayal of the assassination that, whatever its historical accuracy, reignited widespread public interest and renewed pressure on Congress to address the ongoing secrecy surrounding official government records. In response to that surge of public attention, Congress passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act in 1992, legislation that required the National Archives to gather virtually all government records related to the assassination into a single, centralized collection, with the explicit intention of releasing those records to the public within 25 years, setting a final disclosure deadline of October 2017. The law established a review board tasked specifically with evaluating which documents could be safely released, and which required continued redaction for reasons related to national security, and that board operated independently for several years, releasing millions of pages of previously classified material throughout the 1990s. By the time the board concluded its work, an enormous trove of documents had entered the public record, offering researchers unprecedented access to CIA and FBI files, autopsy materials, and internal government communications from the period surrounding the assassination. However, when the long-anticipated 2017 deadline finally arrived, the promised full disclosure did not fully materialize as expected. President Trump, citing ongoing national security concerns raised by the CIA and FBI, authorized a delay, allowing certain sensitive documents to remain withheld or heavily redacted beyond the original deadline, a decision that renewed frustration among researchers who had waited decades for complete access. Additional partial releases occurred in 2018 and again in 2021 and 2022 under the Biden administration, gradually making more material available, though even now, several thousand documents remain either partially redacted or entirely withheld, officially citing ongoing concerns related to intelligence sources, methods, and international relationships that officials argue remain sensitive even 6 decades later. This continued secrecy, regardless of the specific justification offered, has kept alive persisting questions about what exactly remains hidden within those final withheld pages, with some researchers suggesting the remaining material likely contains embarrassing but not necessarily conspiratorial details about intelligence operations, while others maintain more significant answers about the assassination itself may still be waiting inside those sealed files. The Assassination Records Act nevertheless represents one of the most significant transparency efforts connected to any major event in modern American history, fundamentally reshaping how much the public understands about that period, even as it simultaneously demonstrates how difficult complete transparency remains when national security concerns intersect with historical curiosity. Whether the small number of remaining sealed documents contain genuinely significant revelations, or simply routine intelligence details considered sensitive by habit rather than necessity, remains an open question, one that continues to fuel speculation, research, and debate as researchers and everyday citizens alike keep watching for the day when every remaining page finally becomes available for public review.